Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1965. We're going to be taking a look at the Yardbirds and they're going to be performing For Your Love. Now, with this video, I am going to be getting into some of the background behind the Yardbirds, especially the guitar players like Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, and also Jimmy Page, and then how the Yardbirds turned into Led Zeppelin. But let's get these guys up on screen and see how they get on. And there we have it. So a short song and a short performance, and saying that one of the reasons that Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds is because they wanted to go in this more pop direction. And certainly when we break into the second section of the song, we've got two definite songs here, almost totally different songs, going to the upbeat section and then back to the original section that we started with. But Clapton wanted to stay with the blues and have longer tracks rather than going down that pop route and having songs that might only last 2 minutes and 11 seconds or 3 minutes. It was actually with the release of this single that Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds and then Jeff Beck slotted in, who you can see in this video just playing the 12 string, and he would have been 21 at the time of this video, so a fresh-faced Jeff Beck. And it's interesting to see him just strumming out those chords on the 12 string. So with this song, we've got harmony vocals, which is something that you would always find in the 60s and the 70s, loads of bands that had the ability to play and sing at the same time, but also harmonize with each other. And we've also got those two distinct sections to this song. And when it does go into the more up-tempo section, that is Graham Goulding who wrote this song. His idea was to try and emulate the Beatles at the time. He'd go and listen to their songs, and he was a songwriter. He tried to sell his songs to labels, but he was getting rejected. And this song, when he did write it, his manager at the time said, "Oh, you've got to give this to the Beatles." But then Graham said, "I think the Beatles are doing okay for songwriters at the moment," so it was passed on to the Yardbirds. This certainly is a quick track at just over 2 minutes in length, but around these times, 1965, if you could get a band full of guys and young guys singing about love, it was pretty much a sure thing. If they could sing in tune, and if they could harmonize with each other and had the technical ability at their instruments to play as a band in the first place. Obviously, relating this to nowadays, you almost don't need to learn how to play an instrument in order to perform live now because there's so much technology around. But back in the mid-60s, it was a given. You had to have a wide skill set in order just to be a musician in the first place. This track, when it was released, got to number 1 in the UK, it got to number 1 in Canada as well, and it got to number 6 in the USA. So it was a huge hit internationally, and the writer of the song, who I mentioned earlier, Graham Goldman, he was in a band called the Mockingbirds, and they were a semi-professional band, and they were the warm-up band for the show Top of the Pops. And he said that after they'd played their music to get the crowd warmed up, and then the Yardbirds came on, everybody just rushed to the front of the stage, and he was in the crowd, and he just became a member of that crowd. So he was now anonymous, but he's the guy that wrote the song that this band are playing. So he said it did feel a little bit weird being the songwriter for this track that all of these kids are getting into, and he was just at the back of this crowd and nobody knew that he wrote the song. Because this is such a short performance, it means that there isn't a great deal really to analyze. The progression in the first section, we've just got 4 chords, and one of those chords is just a change from a major to a minor. So it's relatively straightforward in terms of the progression, and that split that we have halfway through certainly makes it interesting. But when you've got a song that's only 2 minutes in length, it means that you don't have to have lots of sections to keep people interested, because by the time you've just gone through a couple of sections, effectively a verse and a chorus, it's the end of the song. But what we can do is look at the band and look into the background of how this band, the Yardbirds, eventually then turned into Led Zeppelin. Getting into the band, a lot happened in a short space of time with the Yardbirds, because they started in 1963, and that was Keith Relf, who was on vocals here, and then we also had Chris Dreyer, who played rhythm guitar and bass, and Jim McCarty, who was on drums, and we also had Paul Samwell Smith, who was on bass, and we also had Top Topham, who was the lead guitarist originally in 1963, but then he was replaced in that same year by Eric Clapton, because Top left, and Clapton would then continue to play with the band for 2 more years. As I said, he left when this single was released, 1965. So in 1963, like I said, a lot happened quickly, because they became the house band for a place called the Crawdaddy Club, and the previous house band had moved on, and they were the Rolling Stones. So they were playing at this venue, and the guy that organised all the events there, he was a guy called Giorgio Gamelski, and he became the manager of the band. At this point, Top Topham left the band, and Eric Clapton was then on board, and they were also the backup band, and they toured with Sonny Boy Williamson II. Then, the next year, in 1964, is when they signed to Columbia Records, and they started to record live tracks of performances that they had at Marquee Club in London, and that was called 5 Live Yardbirds, and that was released on New Year's Eve, 1964, but unfortunately that failed to chart. So, after the disappointment of not charting with that live release right at the end of 1964, in 1965, they released 2 singles, and the third single released in March was For Your Love. So that's where things took a turn for the better. Only Eric Clapton now decided that he wanted to move on. So when Eric did move on, he suggested a guy called Jimmy Page to then play in the band, but Jimmy at the time was being very successful in the studio as a session musician, and he wasn't sure about joining the band considering the politics Beck's, that he was a friend of Eric's, and then slotting in, maybe the band he wouldn't get on with. So it's a little bit more complicated than it seemed, at least than it seemed to Jimmy. So Jimmy suggested Jeff Beck, who was a friend of his at the time, and Jeff then slotted in. So just 2 days after Eric left the band, Jeff Beck was now playing with the Yardbirds. As I said, things moved really quickly, and with Jeff's playing, he had a totally different set of influences that you could hear. So it meant that the band's sound now started to go in a more Middle Eastern direction with Indian stylizations, and that was all Jeff Beck's playing because that's what he liked to put in there. And that was certainly evident on Heart Full of Soul in 1965. In 1965, they had a string of successful singles, and off the back of that, they did their first US tour in the same year, in 1965. And while they were out in the USA, they recorded with Sam Phillips at Sun Studios in Memphis. In 1966 is when they released Shape of Things, and that has been referred to as the first psychedelic rock classic, and certainly to do with Jeff Beck's direction with that Middle Eastern influence that I mentioned earlier, but it got to number 3 in the UK, and it got to number 11 in the USA, so it was a massive hit. In 1966 is when they released Yardbirds, aka Roger the Engineer, because on that album cover it had a drawing that was done by Chris Dreyer, just a cartoon, and it had that written on it, Roger the Engineer, when he was referring to Roger Cameron, who was the engineer for the album. And in the USA that was called Over, Under, Sideways, Down. That album was recorded in 1 week, and it has been listed as number 350 on Rolling Stone's Top 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list. And Paul Samwell Smith, again, was still in 1966 here. He quit the band, so it meant that they needed a bassist, and this is when Jimmy Page stepped in and said he didn't mind playing bass, while Chris Dreyer learned to play the bass parts. So that's exactly what Jimmy did. But then Jeff Beck fell ill during the tour, so Jimmy moved over to playing lead guitar once Chris had worked out all of the bass lines and they've got it all up to speed. So then by the time they reunited in London and Jeff was well again, this is where Chris was now on bass and Jimmy was on lead guitar and Jeff Beck was on lead guitar as well. So still in 1966, they released Happenings 10 Years Time Ago, and the bass on that track was played by John Paul Jones. So we've got our first link to the future Led Zeppelin. So during the recording of Jeff Beck's Bolero, which was his first solo recording, he had John Paul Jones on bass, he also had Keith Moon on drums, and he had Nicky Hopkins on piano. And they said at the time, they were just having a discussion about making a supergroup with John Entwistle as well from The Who, and John said that it would go over like a lead balloon, and then Keith Moon said they could call the album Led Zeppelin, but obviously meaning L-E-A-D, and this is something that Jimmy Page remembered from that discussion that they were having whilst the recording was going on with Jeff's solo project. So still in 1966, they were on tour opening up for the Rolling Stones, and also Ike and Tina Turner were part of that tour as well. They were on the bill, and this is the year that Jeff Beck did leave the band, therefore leaving Jimmy Page as the sole remaining lead guitarist in the Yardbirds. In 1967, things went a little bit downhill. They weren't getting the sales, weren't as popular as they were previously, and their last top 50 single in the USA was released at this time, and that was called Ha Ha, Said the Clown. In 1968, they had the Yardbirds' Greatest Hits album released, and that turned out to be their most successful album. Chart-wise, it got to number 28 in the US charts, and around this time, psychedelic blues rock was the in thing. We had bands like Cream and Jimi Hendrix who were playing this new kind of music that really did suit the sound previously of the Yardbirds. But at this time, Keith and Jim wanted to take the writing in a more folk and classical direction, so they didn't write that psychedelic rock that they had done previously. So in 1968 is when they wanted to start to go in a new direction. As I said, Keith wanted to go in that more folky, classical direction. So they asked Terry Reid if he wanted to be the vocalist for the band, and he suggested an unknown singer called Robert Plant. And when Robert Plant got involved, he suggested a drummer, his friend, called John Bonham. So now things are really starting to gel and go in the direction of the future Led Zeppelin. Plant was now the vocalist, and they did a tour of Scandinavia as the new Yardbirds. And when they returned from that tour, Keith said that he had trademarked the Yardbirds, so they had to change the band name, but I think Jimmy Page already wanted to change the band name, especially with the other two guys that are now part of the band, and he remembered that conversation previously about Led Zeppelin. The only thing is that he changed the name to LED Zeppelin rather than Lead, because he didn't want people to say Lead Zeppelin. So that's the thing that they changed, and then went forward from then on, 1968, as Led Zeppelin. In 1992, the Yardbirds were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and this is the same year that they got back together, Chris Dreyer and Jim McCarty as well, to start playing with the band again, and that led to the release in 2003 of their album Birdland. And after that, Jim McCarty is still playing drums with the Yardbirds, so there have been personnel changes, but he's the last remaining original member, as we can see in this video. But a band that I think everybody needs to know about if they do like Led Zeppelin or want to know the history of Led Zeppelin and how that band came about in the first place, because the Yardbirds really did set the foundation for all of those things to later take off. As I said, a lot happened in a very short space of time with the Yardbirds that would then eventually lead to the existence of Led Zeppelin in 1968. But thank you so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!